have shown us that, in fact, evidence does not necessarily support traditional religious beliefs. And that this will be very controversial to many people, but virtually all the archaeologists who I have read have said there is no evidence whatsoever that the Exodus actually ever took place. In other words, it's an origin myth, which is not the same as an historical event. Okay, and this is not to disparage or disrespect anybody's religious tradition, but just to point out one example of, we can have evidence-based beliefs that may very well contradict traditional beliefs. Well, okay, and of course the world has grown smaller. We're aware of other traditions besides our own. And sometimes, rather than simply dismissing them as primitive or whatever, sometimes we would be inclined to say we can actually learn something from them. And that's, it's a good thing for us to do that. And good insofar as promoting peace and promoting mutual nurturance of different cultural traditions. But it also means that there's a loss of authority for any single tradition. Okay, I don't know if you've ever heard the term Ayurveda. Ayurveda is a traditional sort of natural remedy-based tradition from Asia, from South Asia particularly. And I have asked various people I know, who are themselves scholars or whatever, or practitioners of Ayurveda, has anybody actually done clinical testing of Ayurveda to see if it actually works, makes good on its claims? Almost to the person, they reply, this is very old. This tradition's very old. Well, so am I, but that doesn't make me a medical authority, does it? Well, okay. We have, particularly in Western culture, we have lost, the kind of unquestioning authority that we used to give to religious traditions and to religious points of view. So, when Nietzsche proclaims God is dead, and thus spake Zarathustra, what does he mean? Well, continue with the entire quotation. God is dead, and who are the murderers? We are all the murderers. We have all killed God. Well, how have we done that? We've done that because we simply don't see the world the same way as our ancestors did. Okay, have we worshipped other gods? Yeah, reason, science, evidence-based beliefs. Is that a bad thing? Well, probably not. In the eyes of most modern people, it's probably not. There are all kinds of ways in which we can make life less nasty, miserable, and short, if in fact we give due attention to science and to reason and to so forth and so forth. Okay, and let me acknowledge also, lest you misunderstand what I'm saying or misunderstand my intentions. There have been many religious figures who have been at the forefront of promoting science. Many great scientists are themselves religious people. And in fact, the Catholic Church, contrary to what some rank and file members might believe, the Catholic Church has been at the forefront of many scientific investigations. And yes, they have an agenda, but does that mean that they don't promote good science? Well, let me give you a for instance. The Catholic Church has since mid-20th century acknowledged that evolutionary science is good science. And the official position of the Catholic Church is we would be hypocrites to reject evolutionary science when in fact we accept all kinds of other scientific theories that are no better evidenced, or let's say even in many cases, not as well evidenced as evolutionary science. I say evolutionary science rather than evolutionary theory because most people don't seem to understand what theory means. If you've done all the observations, all the testing, gathered all the data, and you then arrive at a mathematical model that puts them in relationship, puts all the observational data in relationship, that's a scientific theory. A theory doesn't mean a guess. A theory doesn't mean, oh, I'm just going to make up a story. Alrighty. Why am I spending so much time on this? Because I think the rise of science and technology is one of the things that radically challenged the traditions that people looked to previously to tell them what life meant, what their purpose was in the world. Now we're saying, you know what? Maybe there is no purpose. Okay? So what are we to do? We're in free fall. Okay? There's no plan, no objective ground for values, and many would say it's not really what would traditionally be considered an objective ground for truth or for belief. Faith does no longer have the status of the gold standard for what we believe and how we live. But neither does reason. It's now evidence. Approximation, probability, this sort of thing. No wonder people who are used to believing that the world is fairly black and white, and that of course there's a meaning, and it's all laid out before us. We just have to be attentive to what we've been told about the meaning of life. Well, that just doesn't work. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny in modern times. So, essentially, what is absurdism? Absurdity, and I'm turning to Camus here for a very good elucidation of that. Absurdity is the intrinsic conflict between our natural desire to find order and purpose and meaning, to want to feel secure, and the fact that there's no grounds for it. Our desire for there to be a meaning of life versus we can't find any grounds for that meaning of life. Now, there are basically three kinds of responses that Camus discusses. First is suicide. We can just say, what's the point? Kill ourselves. That is a kind of bad faith. Why is it a bad faith? Because rather than dealing with the absurdity of human existence, it's a way of just ignoring it. Okay? If our living doesn't make any difference, why would our dying make any difference? If our living has no meaning, why would our dying have any meaning? So suicide is not an answer. Camus famously begins the myth of Sisyphus with one of the most famous sentences of any existentialist writing. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer, and if it is true, as Nietzsche claims, that a philosopher, to deserve our respect, must preach by example, you can appreciate the importance of that reply, for it will precede the definitive act. These are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. Now notice the emotional grasping of the significance of life, the significance of your isness, as I put it before, is grasped through the emotions, and that is explained afterward by the intellect. Okay, and we talked before about about, when we talked about Heidegger and Sartre, about Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am," according to the heavyweights of existentialism would say that he has that backwards. I think, therefore I am. No, the primary fact is not that you think. The primary fact is that you are. You are aware of your own existence. Now, whether that's fair to Descartes, or whether in fact it's simply a different way, a shift of emphasis because of a different way of expressing the same observation, I have no interest in debating that. Let's just take what we can from both perspectives. Okay. Well, suicide is out. So what about Kierkegaard's? Yeah, and Camus very much has Kierkegaard in mind at this point. Kierkegaard's leap of faith. I just jump into that mode of embodying my meaning. The leap of faith. Well, that leap of faith generally involves embracing ideas, doctrines, beliefs, behavior, institutions that has nothing to do with, not really, at least not initially, with your existence. You're being poised like a dancer midair in a leap in your own existence. The leap of faith is a kind of bad faith. It's like saying we can solve these problems just by believing in a particular proposed way of looking at it. That's all we need. Let these institutions and traditions and so forth and so forth and so forth prescribe to us a solution. That's a denial of what Sartre would call a denial of our own freedom. Okay? And that is, a dishonest response, Camus would say, and therefore bad faith, and therefore not an acceptable solution. Well, how about absurdism? What if we just grasp the absurdity of our existence, clear-eyed and without reluctance? We just say, yeah, that's how it is. I had a friend who said once, there are two ways to look at it. One, nothing matters. The other is, hey, nothing matters. Okay? So is that a terrible burden? Is the absurdity a terrible burden? Or is it terribly liberating? Kierkegaard said, act in such a way, or live in such a way that your very existence is an act of rebellion. And indeed, Camus believes that the essence of an authentic life is rebellion against this very situation that we've just described. Freedom that comes from our ability to live with it and to choose and do what we commit ourselves to doing, and passion. We have a passion for living. If we don't have a passion for living, why are we living? Why bother to live if you don't have a passion for living? Okay? So, what do we do about absurdity? Well, one answer to that is existentialism. And guess what? Kierkegaard denied being an existentialist. Sartre did describe himself as an existentialist, at least at some point in his career, until he converted to Marxism. Okay? say converted but I don't want it to sound like it's a religious conversion. He decided that he should commit himself to Marxism as a means of liberation and endorsing the autonomy and the independence of other people. Now understand when he says Marxism, when Sartre said Marxism, he doesn't mean like Soviet-style communism or Chinese-style communism or anything like that. What he had in mind was certain principles that amounted to his understanding of the ideas of Karl Marx. Not necessarily how those have been historically fleshed out by people who call themselves Marxists. And guess who said, "I am not a Marxist" toward the end of his life? Karl Marx. Seriously, someone asked him at an international convention to organize labor. Right? Someone asked him a question about Marxism, and Marx waved the person away and said, "Don't ask me, I'm not a Marxist." What does that mean? Well, something similar I've heard many Christians say, if Jesus were on earth today, he would not recognize what we call Christianity. In fact, some Christians today say he would be aghast at what we call Christianity. Okay? Well, I'm not saying that's true or that's not true. What I'm saying is that, what does that mean? What that means is that once something becomes institutionalized, and this is something we've talked about before, once something becomes institutionalized, it gets involved with dogmas, it gets involved with tradition and giving authority to tradition, giving authority to other people to decide for us what is and what isn't Orthodox doctrine. And Marx was not in favor of that. And, no great thinker was really saying, here's who you should surrender your freedom to, because surrendering your freedom is bad faith. It's a denial of the fact that you are by nature free and must take responsibility for your choices. So, who actually called themselves existentialists? Heidegger denied being an existentialist. Camus, at least at various times in his career, denied being an existentialist. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard never used the terms existentialism because it came into being, or it came into use after both of them, after their lifetimes. People debate, was Martin Buber, the Hebrew philosopher, an existentialist? And some say absolutely. You take a look at his talking about relationships, about perceiving the other as a free entity and blah, 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 all that stuff that sounds very familiar. Say, yeah, well, why not call him an existentialist? And it usually comes up as, and people who don't want to call him an existentialist usually come up with something like, well, he doesn't discuss all of the core topics that, say, Heidegger or Sartre discuss. Well, that's true of other people we would call existentialists as well. And he is essentially philosophizing within the context of religious commitments. Well, hey, how about Søren Kierkegaard? Was he not doing the same? Although there are people who will deny that Kierkegaard is an existentialist on exactly those grounds. Okay, Sartre had sometimes actually called himself an existentialist, and he did write the famous essay, Existentialism and Human Emotions. And at other times, he was not comfortable calling himself an existentialist. So what exactly does it mean to call someone an existentialist, and how is existentialism a response to the absurdity of human life? Well, existence precedes essence. And because of that, we've talked about that before, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time explaining what that means. But basically, the importance of that is important because we create who we are. Okay? We create who we are. We create what our lives are. We create what our humanity is. We choose, and we choose within the context of actually radical freedom. the fact that we are in that situation where we must choose, and remember, even if you refuse to choose or ignore the fact that you have choices, you are, in doing that, you are making a choice. So, the fact that we have to choose, we cannot escape our freedom. As Jean-Paul Sartre puts it, we are condemned to freedom. Can't get out of it. You can pretend, but you can't actually get out of it. So we have, because of our radical freedom, there is no way to fully satisfy our desire for meaning, for pattern, for understanding, for making sense of life. We are stuck in ambiguities, changeability, imperfection. We have, you name it. We don't have, as people might have believed in earlier times in our civilization, a clear-cut, detailed plan that has been articulated to us and that we can trust as being the definitive answer about what life is about and who we are and what we ought to do. Sorry, you're free. A Saudi Arabian author I knew back when I was in graduate school wrote a short story about political prisoners who were being kept in a sort of behind a fence. And one evening, one of them wakes up and realizes one of the guards left the gate open. They can leave. And then one by one, they all wake up and see, we could actually leave. You know what they do? They roll over and go back to sleep. And are relieved, actually, when the next morning the guards have locked the gate. Why? Because it's a big risk to stay where they are, but it's a big risk to flee. Okay? So, if you choose not to choose, then you're choosing the status quo, and you're responsible for that. Well, happiness, says Camus, and absurdity are inseparable. They are the sons of the same earth. Now, how is that? He said, live in such a way that your very existence is an act of rebellion. For Camus, rebellion, freedom, passion, that is a clear-eyed embracing of the absurdity of human existence, to have rebellion, rage against the dying of the light, to have passion, and to fully acknowledge our freedom. That is the way to escape meaninglessness. Okay? Existentialism traditionally says we create our own meaning. Is Camus saying that? Or is he simply saying, live with passion, live with commitment, in spite of the fact that there's really no meaning to whether you do or don't? Well, he can be interpreted different ways, particularly because much of what he said was articulated in literary works, novels, plays, and so forth. And of course, those sorts of things are open to all kinds of different interpretations. Dr. Rowe in The Plague, which is my personal favorite of Camus' novels, is battling against a plague, and he knows it's fruitless. Plagues will always occur. He can only do a small amount to relieve the suffering. and to contain the plague from spreading. What does he do? He wholeheartedly throws himself into doing what he can do because he's doing that with passion and commitment. Okay? People who are activists in the world for one way or another, trying to improve the lot of humanity or the lot of the planet or whatever, frequently end up suffering from burnout. Why is that? Well, because they expect they're going to see bang, 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 all these changes. And in fact, they can labor for years and years and years and see very little change. Or if they do make accomplishments, they can, 5 years later, see a shift in the political climate and see everything they've gained being reversed. So what do? You keep on fighting. You keep on with your freedom, your rebellion, and your passion, because that makes you fully human and fully alive. And that, for Camus, is how we deal with the absurdity of human existence. Now, I'm going to include in this week's module a short film, not of my own, but a short film that was done to introduce a play called Waiting for Godot, which many people see as a quintessential expression of absurdism. Two people waiting randomly, waiting, let's say, aimlessly, and interminably for this Godot to show up. Many people have said Godot is clearly a metaphor for God. Guess what? Godot never shows. They want to ask him all kinds of questions, but he never shows. They're wondering what they're supposed to do, but he never shows. And their dialogue becomes more and more, shall we say, absurd. Okay. There was there was one production of Waiting for Godot that starred as the two men, Steve Martin and Jim Carrey. Now, so I've known a few theater people who find it appalling when you do a play by an absurdist play and you do it as if you expect people to laugh. But in fact, there's just a thin border between hilariously funny and wrenchingly tragic. Something can be both at the same time. And indeed, absurdism is oftentimes both very funny and very tragic at the same time. Okay. Now there are a number of streamable versions of Waiting for Godot that are out there online. If you care to, after seeing the introduction, if you care to actually hunt it down and play it. And I searched and I did not find one that I thought was of acceptable quality to assign it. But so what? It's what I want to do is to use it as an illustration and to use this introduction to Waiting for Godot, not as an introduction to examining the literary merit of the play, although it's been a very highly praised and influential play, but rather to show how absurdism actually has been presented in the arts, the effect that it's had on contemporary culture. Okay. Always, when I think of theater of the absurd, I always think of Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. I believe I mentioned this early in the course. I heard people complain when the movie was first out after seeing it. They never do actually tell you what the meaning of life is. No, wait a minute. Right smack in the middle of the film, they have this interlude that seems completely disconnected from the rest of the film. And people in strange costumes uttering gibberish, as though that gibberish is magical, as though it's incantation, as though it's It's the most important of rituals. While they are looking for a fish, while there is no fish. Okay? Now, as far as I'm concerned, they just pretty much summed up hilariously this whole business about looking for the meaning of life. Camus said, if you look for the meaning of life, you're not going to find it. The meaning of life is realized by embodying it, by living it. Just as he said, if you look for happiness, you're never going to be happy. Embrace life. That's a very positive message, and one that's, I think, it's perfectly legitimate to take away from Camus. People may argue about it, but it certainly seems to be there, not to sugarcoat life or to sanitize it or to anesthetize ourselves about all the stuff that's rotten in life, but fully admitting the imperfection of life to nevertheless passionately live in celebration, if you will, of our freedom, where our very existence is an act of rebellion. Okay. I had to stop the filming about 10 minutes into this video, so you're going to see this loaded as 2 videos back to back. Just watch both of them. It'll be very clear from the way I've labeled them which one to watch first. Thank you.